Good afternoon. So very glad to have you with us. Good afternoon. Welcome to RCRC's Religion and Repro Learning Center. I am Reverend Carrie Jackson. I am the Director of Spiritual Care and Activism at RCRC, and really glad to have you with us today. We have an exciting webinar today. Before we get there, though, I'm going to make you wait for a little bit. Before we get there, I want to tell you about some other webinars we have coming up during the month of November. November 4th, we will do an international conversation looking at attitudes and abortion laws around the world. So we will have one speaker in Korea, another speaker in France, and another speaker in the US, and we will bring those conversations together. And I think that's going to be absolutely amazing. And then on November 18th, we will continue our international look at reproductive dignity, and specifically looking at the issue of C-sections and the business of medicine. So we'll look at forced sterilizations, C-sections, and why that's happening in various countries, including the US, around the world. So please do not miss that. Because those will be international conversations on November 4 and November 18, instead of having our usual 3 or 4 p.m. Eastern time, we will have those a little different. So watch the registration. On the 4th, it will be 10 a.m. for all of those of you who are in Eastern time, so that we can accommodate our amazing speakers who are in South Korea and in France. And then on November 18th, that will also be earlier in the day, again, to accommodate for our international guests. Don't miss them. If you have not received your schedule for the upcoming registration for the webinars, please let us know. Put that in the chat, and we'll be glad to send that information to you. I have another very special announcement that I'm so excited about. We are about to launch our online courses as part of the Religion and Repro Learning Center. We will be launching such courses as fetal life and personhood, religious repro ethics, family planning, reproductive racism, and so on. Those are just the first several we will launch this month, and then several more in January, and another several more later in 2022. We have more than 65 different presenters for these courses. They're phenomenal. I have learned so much just curating these courses, and I am convinced you will learn a lot for your work as well. Stay tuned, don't miss those. They will all be free for the balance of 2021. And then we're going to start charging, not a lot, but please make sure you jump in while they are free. For today, as always, we are inviting you to participate in a Q&A with our amazing speaker today. So please write your questions, any things that come to your heart and mind as you hear her sharing the incredible information that's about to come to you. Put that in the Q&A, and we invite others. If someone writes a question that you say, oh, I want to know that too, please click on it so you upvote it. We usually get lots of questions. Of course, we don't have ample time to respond to all of them, but we want to get to as many of the most pressing, most pertinent questions on your hearts and minds as possible. But we will keep track of all the questions that come in. And so even if we're not able to respond to your question today, please know we've taken note of it, and it might be the very question you ask that helps inform our planning for subsequent webinars or online courses. So your questions are very important to us. Now in the chat, we invite all of you. Let us know who you are, where you're from as you're participating in this webinar. And so even though we won't get to see you and hear you, we want to hear from you. You understand what I'm saying? We want to hear from you in the chat and in the Q&A. So today's session is going to go in Eastern time to about 5:15. So wherever you are in the country or in the world, that's a 75-minute session for today. And we will leave the last 25 minutes of our conversation today for your questions. I'm going to introduce this amazing speaker now because I really, really want her to have all of the time. But I want to start with this. Several months ago, when I asked our speaker today, Rachel, if she would come and talk with us about Christian Dominionism, a lot of things have happened in the country since the idea first came to do this. Now, on January 6th, when we experienced the insurrection at the US Capitol, many of us were surprised. Many of us have also been surprised to see how blatant the attacks have been on voting rights and reproductive rights over the past several months. More than 17 states have enacted laws to make it harder to vote. More than 500 bills have been introduced to restrict or ban abortion. But I want to share a personal story with you that goes back to the week of the insurrection. If you recall, the day before the insurrection, Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock were elected, a Jew and a Black, elected as US senators from the state of Georgia. Then the insurrection happened. 2 days after the insurrection, I received a knock on my door, my home, from 2 FBI agents saying they wanted to find out from me my experiences of traveling to Cuba. The last time I had traveled to Cuba was 5 years ago. I'm wondering, why are you here at my house 2 days after the insurrection? I didn't participate in it. Why are we talking about Cuba when something as heinous as the insurrection trying to interrupt our voting process? Why are you here? So I listened, I responded to their questions, and finally they wound their way to, oh, do you know Reverend Raphael Warnock? I knew Raphael when he and I were both students at Union Theological Seminary. And that's when I discovered why they were there, to develop or to add to whatever dossier they had on this Black man who had been elected US Senator from the state of Georgia. And I'm sure similar things were happening with anyone who had any associations with Jon Ossoff. I share that story because it is on point, I believe, with the kind of legislative and overall system activities happening in this country that center in Christian Dominionism. We think this conversation is important for you to see because to understand why things some of us never imagined happening in this country are happening, and that are happening so overtly and blatantly. This wonderful, amazing woman is going to open that for us. We wanted her to do a deep dive today. So rather than having a few speakers, I asked just this one person to come. Rachel Tabachnick is an independent researcher, former associate fellow at Public Research Associates, longtime contributor to Talk to Action website, and has written in a myriad of publications exploring the issues of the religious right on policy, politics, domestic and foreign, and the intersections there are with the conservative infrastructure and various think tanks. She's been interviewed on NPR and a variety of other radio and print media across the country because her research is so on point. And even though Rachel considers herself retired, because she is a font of knowledge on the various dominionist movements that have been shaping so much of the politics in this country, we're glad that she's come a little out of retirement to be with us today. Rachel, thank you for being with us and welcome. And I give this time to you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Carey. I'm now going to share my screen. So just give me a minute here. So thank you so much. Again, it is a pleasure to be here. So today we're talking about the role of anti-abortion politics in the dominionist assault on democracy. As I was preparing this quote kept popping into my head. As they say, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, or a quote thereabouts. So I was looking it up to see if I could find who it was to give them credit. Maybe it's Mark Twain, maybe it's not, but as it turns out, it leads Margaret Atwood's book, The Testament. So then I said, yes, this is appropriate. And let me tell you why it's appropriate. You know, we keep talking about we're going back to a time before Roe v. Wade, and we are. It looks as if we are. But it also presents new challenges. As far as I know, there weren't Texas bounty hunters in pre-Roe v. Wade. We have a very different world now. So not only should we be looking at the problem of going backwards, but what new challenges there are going to be going forward. Dominionism that we're going to talk about today comes from two different sectors. One, Christian Reconstructionism, and two, the New Apostolic Reformation. I'll be spending a lot more time on Christian Reconstructionism, but I wanted to include the New Apostolic Reformation for reasons that you will see, and because this is where I have spent most of my last 20 years of research work. One, Christian Reconstructionism emerged from the Calvinist Presbyterian sector of Christianity, the other from the Pentecostal and Charismatic sector. And they are very different. Now, it goes without saying, these are movements. So just because they emerge from those streams does not mean that everybody in those streams is this, just like we see in the religious right, in the Christian right. This is a movement that has spread far beyond the denominational designations from where they emerged. And then we'll have discussion. There are a few things that I will be saying that I want you to think about as we go along for discussion. Frederick Clarkson, who I believe who is here with us now, was one of a small group of researchers who wrote and spoke about Christian Reconstructionism in the 1980s and 1990s. This is a 1997 book, but it's still very relevant and one of the best sources for understanding the anti-democratic threat of Christian Reconstructionism. This book was published at a time that there had been a lot of anti-abortion violence. And I want to zoom in on something that Frederick said on the back of the book. Drawing on the years of rigorous research, Clarkson exposes the wild card of the theology of vigilantism, which urges the enforcement of God's law and argues for fundamentalist revolution against constitutional democracy. And then this, contrary to popular belief, these figures are usually neither nuts nor alone. 20 plus years later, we're at a very different stage of this. This is one of the new abortion abolitionist organizations, fairly new, really emerging on the scene. Three things to point out here. Note where it says nullification and interposition. The second point, for this organization, Stopping a fertilized egg from implanting is murder. And they designate almost all forms of birth control as murder outside of condoms and the rhythm method. This movement also has a very different attitude toward women than, let's say, the more mainstream anti-abortion organizations that try to claim that they are helping and supporting women. One of the things that we'll be talking about is the doctrine of the lesser magistrate, which has a very important role in what is taking place right now. Some of you will probably recognize the name Matthew Trewhella, a signer of the defensive action statement that preceded some of the murders that took place in the 1990s, and the founder of Missionaries to the Preborn. We will be looking at interposition, nullification, and the doctrine of the lesser magistrate, as you see the book that he has written here, in the context of dominionism. So we are now in old but very new territory. What is dominionism? I'm going to give you a more detailed definition at the end of the webinar, but for now, let's hear it directly from one of these leaders. This is C. Peter Wagner, considered the founder of the New Apostolic Reformation.
Dominion has to do with control. Dominion has to do with rulership. Dominion has to do with authority and subduing. And it relates to society. In other words, what is talked about, what the values are in heaven need to be made manifest here on earth. Dominion means being the head and not the tail. Dominion means ruling as kings. It says in Revelation chapter 1:6 that he has made us kings and priests. And check the rest of that verse. It says for dominion. So we are kings for dominion.
Now let's move on to Christian Reconstructionism. I'm going to be skipping over a lot of the history and theology that we could be talking about, which makes me a little sad, but we need to go directly to the few points that I would like to make today. So let's quickly look at two of the major figures in the movement. Rousas J. Rushdoony, now deceased, and Gary North. Now, if you have some familiarity with Christian Reconstructionism already, you will know that it's about bringing government in all areas of life under biblical law, a continuation of the Mosaic law in the Old Testament with some exceptions. Now, this capital punishment would include, according to Gary North, public execution of women who have abortions and those who advise them to have an abortion. This is an openly theocratic movement, although they refer to it as theonomic, and they argue that this is a bottom-up movement with no intent of a top-down takeover. The central text for this movement is the Institutes of Biblical Law, my big copy right here, which calls for the death penalty for a wide range of crimes, including heresy, blasphemy, witchcraft, astrology, adultery, sodomy or homosexuality, incorrigible juvenile delinquency, and unchastity before marriage, which applies, of course, only to women. This quote is from Howard Phillips, one of the leaders in the development of the Christian right, the most influential man of the 20th century. He also said the whole Christian conservative movement had its genesis in Rush, the other Rush, Rushdoony, not Limbaugh. How can this be? There's another quote from some of the Christian right leaders: though we hide their books under the bed, we read them just the same. One of the reasons why Rushdoony has had so much influence involves the development of conservative infrastructure in the 1970s and 1980s. This slide here is of the National Affairs briefing of the Religious Roundtable in 1980. You see here James Robeson, Ronald Reagan, and D. James Kennedy there to the side of Ronald Reagan. As this infrastructure grew, Rushdoony's ideas went out in bits and pieces. The Christian right leaders took what they wanted, discarded what they didn't want. In that slide before of the National Affairs briefing, 15,000 people were there as they introduced Ronald Reagan as he was running for president. One of those people who was there on the stage and speaking was Gary North. But Rushdoony, despite the impact that some of the leaders recognized he had, was not there because he was a lightning rod for these ideas about capital punishment. And yet there was much that the Christian right liked in what he was presenting and wanted to use. If you'll take a look at this is some of the books from D. James Kennedy's ministry, including Reclaiming America for Christ. Look through at these other books: Attacking Public School, Against Hate Crime Laws, Americans' Christian Heritage, A Christian Nationalist History, Attacks on the ACLU. So what Rushdoony provided is something that a package that included attacking what these fundamentalists hated and feared most in society, often expressed in terms of this is communist, this is socialist. But Rushdoony provided a way to sacralize these ideas and at the same time not just tear down the old order, but provide a blueprint for the new order. As I said, some of these things included promotion of home and private schooling instead of government schools. They're so-called government schools. We don't have time to go in all of the role that Rushdoony played in homeschooling education. He's considered the father of modern day homeschooling, nationalist history, and then also the meme of secular humanism as a competing religion against Christianity. Another thing that permeates all of this work is the idea that there is no such thing as social justice, or no such thing as social injustice. It is only individual. Social justice in their concept is socialism and leads to the de-Christianization of society. The movement produced an abundance of materials, thousands and thousands of pages of books that provide the blueprint for how this new society will be reconstructed on biblical law. And as you can see here, it's divided into every area of life: family, education, politics, international relations. This is another series of books edited by Gary North in the early 1980s. And as you can see here, the theology of Christian resistance, the tactics of Christian resistance. Here we have the strategy and the tactics, the planning. Let me point out just a couple of things in these books. One is throughout the redefining of religious liberty versus religious toleration. They're redefining religious liberty. They're combating liberation theology in Latin America. And Larry Pratt from from GOA, the very right-wing organization, is telling them to support the sagebrush rebellions as opportunities, stop disarmament by anti-Christian governments, and celebrating the formation of militias against tyrannical government. I want to make a comment before we go on about this first volume here for a minute. Look at that, the failure of the American Baptist culture. What is interesting about this volume is that one of the main things that the Reconstructionists brought to the Christian right was a significant change in eschatology or end times narrative. Not that everybody immediately changed away from what we call premillennial dispensationalism, but it started a move away from dispensationalism toward postmillennialism. I'm not going to go into that in more detail now, but what Rushdoony presented was a vision of dominion in the here and now on earth, however many years it would take, but before the second coming of Jesus. Now, one of the things that Gary North does in this first volume over and over is talk about the intellectual schizophrenia of the new Christian right, which he believes has a theology that doesn't match their agenda of gaining political power or transforming, reconstructing the nation. He talks about these thousands and thousands of people who are at the National Affairs briefing on their feet cheering for something that doesn't align with their theology and the need for them to change their theology. This is a long quote, but I would like for us to read this because it really will give you a sense of how the movement uses religious liberty. So let's be blunt about it. We must use the doctrine of religious liberty to gain independence for Christian schools until we raise up a generation of people who know that there is no religious neutrality, no neutral law, no neutral education, no neutral civil government. Then they will get busy in constructing a Bible-based social, political, and religious order, which finally denies the religious liberty of the enemies of God. And he goes on. Murder, abortion, and pornography will be illegal. God's law will be enforced. It will take time. Minority religion cannot do this. Theocracy must flow from the hearts of a majority of citizens, just as compulsory education came after most people had their children in schools of some sorts. And that's Gary North. So here again, Gary North is pointing out that this has got to be, in a sense, a bottom-up movement for it to work. I want to talk a little bit now about another part of this movement, which sounds like an oxymoron, but you really need to grasp this, I think, to understand how this has spread so far and to really understand the movement. I'm going to quote almost directly from an article written by Catherine Stewart now, because she said this so well. Setting aside the hardline Dutch Reformed theologians who supplied the backbone of his thought, Rushdoony drew on two traditions that would prove essential in understanding the genesis of today's Christian nationalist movement. The first was the pro-slavery theology of America's antebellum preachers. The second was the economic libertarianism that took root in reaction to the New Deal. Okay, we're going to come back in a moment to Rushdoony's defense of slavery and what that means. But let's talk about theocratic libertarianism for a moment, how significant it is to understanding this. Christian Reconstructionism's biblical worldview, the total package of all this theology that we don't have time to talk about, is the synthesis of biblical law and libertarian economics, specifically Austrian school economics. So we have a Bible that is grounded in property rights. There's a lot of interesting history about this, which we don't have time to go into either, but I want to show you one thing. There's an organization called Spiritual Mobilization. This is from 1958. This is their magazine from 1958. The idea of spiritual mobilization is that businessmen like Howard Pugh were funding them in order to sell pastors on the idea of rolling back the New Deal. So here, this one happens to be a Labor Day issue, a moral critique of labor, and pastors can win $500. There's a lot of money in 1958. $500 in awards go to the pastor with the best sermon critical of labor unions. Now, again, we don't have time to go into all of this history, but both Rushdoony and North became deeply involved in the world of Austrian school economics, the world of Friedrich von Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, and this encouraged them to create a synthesis between their biblical theology and Austrian economics. For one thing, they were very deeply involved in this world, but hated what they saw as the libertine nature of most libertarians of the time. This ended up with a lot of overlap and cross-pollination with, let's say, the old right and like the John Birch Society. The US Taxpayer Party and Constitution Party is a theocratic party that was the formed by Howard Phillips after his disgust with Reagan and other Republicans that didn't do what they wanted them to do. He formed this party, and Rushdoony helped write the platform and spoke at some of the party conventions. The Mises Institute is important in this story. Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. Again, a long and interesting story of how that came to be. But this is an institute with over 300 scholars, very popular with young people, that represents the, what I'll call paleo-libertarian part of the movement, and overlaps with the John Birch Society and the neo-confederate movement. And this is the part of politics that Ron Paul is central to in terms of connective tissue. This is an article I did for PRA a few years ago on, as I was watching the rise of nullification and the 10th movement, sort of a resurrection of the old states' right movement, and the formation of a neo-confederate think tank. And so this is the world that many of the Reconstructionists are plugged into. For example, Gary North is the creator and administers Ron Paul's homeschooling curriculum. Let's go back to the Civil War with the role of the intersection with neo-Confederates. Rushdoony resurrected a lot of Civil War area pastors' writings, like R.L. Dabney's, probably the most important advocate of the Civil War as a theological war, and helped revive this through the 1960s and onward. This idea is based in the belief that this was not a war about slavery, but it was the Orthodox Christian South against a heretical and tyrannical North and federal government. Rushdoony was not the sole source of this, just like he wasn't the sole source of many of the things that we're talking about, but his work fed and cross-pollinated with other sources in the 1980s and the 1990s, including the League of the South, which was formed in 1994. There's a lot of original founders of League of the South who were involved with both the Mises Institute and the Abbeville Institute. And Rushdoony had different audiences than these sectors. He very much impacted the world of homeschooling and private school curriculum, where this sort of a little bit watered down, but the Civil War as a theological war was included in these texts. Now, there's another place where there's an intersection that you might not expect, that I was really quite surprised to read about in Julie Ingersoll's book. Julie Ingersoll is someone who came from inside of the movement and left the movement, and was pointing out that in the lead up to the Tea Party movement, a group of Christian Reconstructionists in Atlanta were connected to Liberty Alliance, which was a hub of something like 37 member websites with 1 million views a day at the height of the Tea Party movement, with at least half of these Liberty Alliance leaders coming right out of this Reconstructionist entity near Atlanta, American Vision. So on what looked like a Tea Party website, this is one, Godfather Politics, where Gary DeMar, the head of American Vision, wrote regularly. Gary North had a website, Tea Party Economics, and there were other websites. Girls Just Want to Have Guns, Minutemen News, Politichicks, and the celebrity websites were hosted by this group of Kirk Cameron and Victoria Jackson, who was famous for being on Saturday Night Live. So according to Ingersoll, Victoria Jackson has also traveled on study cruises where Gary DeMar lectured and has appeared on his radio show. Ingersoll also points out that the 2009 Worldview Conference of this Reconstructionist organization featured many of the themes that resonated with the emerging Tea Party: restoring state sovereignty, the 10th Amendment, restoring the sanctity of life state by state. And Herb Titus spoke there, not a self-declared Reconstructionist, but a fellow traveler who speaks at Reconstructionist events and was Howard Phillips' vice president on the ticket in 1996 for the Constitution Party. And he was also dean at the Pat Robertson founded Regent University Law School and supervised the master's thesis of former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell, drawing on the Biblical Blueprint series that I showed you before. Titus was also legal counsel to GOA, which, as we mentioned, was founded by Larry Pratt. Also at this event, Gary North spoke on the gold standard and predicted that Islam would inherit the wealth of the West. So you see, Reconstructionism has spread through some unexpected places and doesn't necessarily look like what we would think. There are hubs of this sort of merged Austrian school economics with biblical worldview, including several colleges in the country. One is Hillsdale College in Michigan. If you recall, the Trump administration's patriotic education mandate that came out to the commission just before he left office, this was led by the president of Hillsdale College. So throughout these movements, there is also an attempt to turn the tables on the claims of racism. And this is one of the roles that anti-abortion activism as abolition plays. Also, there's a promotion of narratives that provide a different history and legal justifications for interposition, nullification, and even secession. And one of the things that Christian Reconstructionism has added to this dialogue is the concept of the lesser magistrate. So let's look at that for a moment. Again, these ideas aren't exclusive to Christian Reconstructionism. We've had the interposition and nullification around for a long time. You may remember this from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Many violent anti-abortionists have justified their actions in Reconstructionist teachings. And one of these was Paul Hill, who was studied under a Reconstructionist, one of the major Reconstructionist leaders, and corresponded with others before the shooting in the 1990s of the doctor and his bodyguard. Paul Hill sent correspondence back and forth to Gary North, and Gary North responded after the murders had taken place in a book, Lone Gunners for Jesus, in 1994. And what is interesting about this is that although Paul Hill claimed to draw his inspiration from these beliefs and the idea that anybody associated with abortion should be murdered, Gary North took him to task. He said, "You're going to burn in hell. You've been excommunicated." And this is because Paul Hill stepped outside the bounds of the guidelines set by the movement. And what does that mean? This is another book that Gary North had written in support of Operation Rescue. And I want to read to you a key phrase here that helps us to sort of understand where this is going. We need a statement that under no circumstances will Operation Rescue or any of its official representatives call for armed resistance to civil authority without public support from a lesser magistrate. Now, what does this mean? Just in brief, okay, we've got to keep going here. The lesser magistrate is someone who interposes or resists the tyranny of a higher authority. So, and in this case, in Christian Reconstructionism, and I won't read through all of this, but on the basis of their belief of what is the law or word of God, they are allowed to, on the advice, on the interposition of a lesser magistrate commit acts of violence. Let me move along here. As I showed you, one of the people who's out there promoting the lesser magistrate, the doctrine of the lesser magistrate idea, is Matthew Trewhella, who is now all over radio, internet, claiming to meet with state legislators, attorney generals, and at the moment, with the cause of fighting the tyranny of mask mandates and the vaccination for COVID. So you can see how this is a concept that is not just limited to abortion. It is a concept that can be used in resistance of government authority all over the country in all different kinds of ways. FEMA, EPA, Bureau of Land Management, and so forth. One of the updated, most recent looks at this is this 2012 book by Joel McDermott, who is the son-in-law of Gary North, Restoring America One County at a Time. And this goes beyond states' rights to what we'll call county rights, an idea found in Rushdoony's early writings. McDermott writes about Herb Titus, speaking at that American Vision conference we were talking about, constructing statutes that would effectively displace Roe v. Wade, even if Roe v. Wade is still on the books. A decentralized approach is best, and that this can apply to all the 10th Amendment or states' rights or local rights interest. This particular page reference footnotes contacts for groups like the constitutional sheriffs and peace officers led by Richard Mack. Richard Mack was a board member of the Oath Keepers and then spun off this group with a similar purpose of sheriffs and police. Training these sheriffs in a Reconstructionist worldview are people like Michael Peruka, who was also a VP with Howard Phillips for the Constitution Party. At this point, I want to take a little break before we go on to the New Apostolic Reformation.
Wow, is what I want to come. I'm taking so many notes myself, and I'm seeing in the chat some comments happening there as well. So I want to thank Eleanor for the question you have put in the Q&A, and to use this opportunity to invite others to put your questions. I have a million questions already, Rachel, and so thank you for that. Really looking at, who are the enemies of God? Is that everybody? Bible as formative for property rights, really looking at that, just fantastic. I appreciated what you said, social justice equals socialism in this context, and so very, very much more. So thank you for that. And change in the understanding of eschatology, not waiting for this return of Jesus to have dominion, but bringing it into the now. So lots of wonderful things that I'm taking in and processing. So thank you so very much for that. So again, please get your questions in there. Special thanks to Frederick Clarkson, who is with us today, for introducing me to Rachel. And thank you for your incredible work through the years. And Catherine Stewart, I think I saw that you are with us as well today. Thank you for your work through the years as well. And Rachel referenced a quote from you already, and we will hear more. So Rachel, that was as long a break as you're going to get. I invite you now to dive in and talk with us about the New Apostolic Reformation. And I'm someone who grew up in the Apostolic Church. And so this is a very different orientation on that. And so I look forward to that. Thank you, Rachel.
Okay, so moving along, we'll be talking about the New Apostolic Reformation, just very, very briefly, unfortunately, before we go to discussion. But we need to look at it briefly because it has many things in common with Christian Reconstructionism, but does not look anything like it. Also, this is where I have done most of my research over the last 20 plus years. So this is a diverse movement. There are Black, Latino, Asian, women apostles. It uses the language of social justice, but does not mean it in the sense that we mean it. It is, they are more aligned with the ideas and political ideas of Christian Reconstructionism. And this movement includes some of the largest Latino churches in the country, including the one where former President Donald Trump did some of his campaigning. This is an article that I wrote for PRA several years ago, and looking at this movement and its roots and its impact. Gary North, going back to Gary North for a minute, described a three-legged stool that would support Reconstructionism, and he included in it the Baptist schools, fundamentalist schools for the spread of homeschooling and private school education, and the Pentecostal charismatic world because of its media savvy and its reach on the networks. What ended up happening is that the Pentecostal charismatic stream had its own history that it drew upon, and a very different product came forth. Just to give you an idea of why this is also important, the Pentecostal and charismatic stream as a whole, and as we know, we're not talking about the whole stream, we're talking about a movement that came out of it, but Pentecostal and charismatic stream today is the second largest block of Christianity after Roman Catholicism, with approximately 644 million people, are 26% of all Christians worldwide. So this movement is drawing from a large population and is itself quite large, although very difficult to quantify. Wagner claimed quite a few years ago that they had 40,000 churches, and that at that time that it was near or larger than the Southern Baptist Convention. But again, it is very hard to quantify. You've met C. Peter Wagner, who described himself as the chronicle of the movement and not the founder, because he took something that was already going on inside of part of what we call the neo-Pentecostal or neo-charismatic sector, and then packaged that with a lot of new ideas. He was already a world-renowned leader in the church growth movement. He taught at Fuller Theological Seminary, and he left there to begin what he called the era of the New Apostolic Reformation, which he said officially started in 2001. Now, what does that mean? It was a change in government of the church, inside of the church, and its relation to other churches. It's a post-denominational movement with no intention of ever becoming a denomination, because it's supposed to unite all of Christianity under the umbrella of these networks of apostles and prophets. So Wagner, to make this short, packaged dominionism, similar to Reconstructionism, but also different in many ways, with this new emergence of modern day apostles and prophets who are going to reform, transform, reclaim the world. He also packaged it with a lot of other interesting things, but we won't have time to go over, that changed the nature of evangelism. For instance, he believed that saving souls one by one was going too slow, and therefore it was time to conduct spiritual warfare to take territory, land. We're back to land again, to take cities, to take nations. So this was a very different package that potentially is a bit more top down because of their political aspirations. And as you will see, how much they have gotten involved in politics in this country. One of their main campaigns that sort of expresses this easily without us having to go into a lot of theological detail is called Reclaiming the Seven Mountains, the Seven Mountains Mandate. So they took what was in thousands and thousands of pages of Christian Reconstructionist ideas about all different areas of life and took it down to a movie and posters and prayer networks looking at reclaiming the seven mountains: business, government, family, religion, media, education, and entertainment. And this has spread all over the world. You can see legislators, writing about the seven mountains for the day of prayer. I mean, it is truly has spread all over the world since about around 2006, 2007, when it was developed as an idea by one of the apostles named Lance Wallnau. And this is Lance Wallnau here, second from the left. This is Kenneth Copeland's television network. And what you see here is Lance Wallnau, who was the author also of the book on Donald Trump called God's Chaos Candidate, Donald J. Trump and the American Unraveling. And you see him here with the, to the right, the My Pillow guy. And if I'm remembering this correctly, Donald Trump will call into the show, and I'm thinking he actually called into that particular show that day. Lance Wallnau was one of the earliest champions of Donald Trump's candidacy, and one of the people who put out the prophecy that he would be like King Cyrus. He didn't need to be one of them, that he would be a King Cyrus. And I point this out because one of the major differences in this movement from Christian Reconstructionism, since it is not cessationist, okay, since they believe that miracles, speaking in tongues, revelation, direct revelation from God continues to their apostles and prophets, they can jump up in the middle of a service or put out through their media airwaves that a prophet has gotten a message from God. And this is the message, and you should follow that message. So if the prophet or the apostle says the message from God is that Donald Trump is to be our leader, then this has weight in the community. One of the other things that's important about the movement, and let's checking how we're doing for time, we need to wrap it up, is that there are prayer networks developed state by state, just as we see in politics in the conservative infrastructure of the new right. And these are very politically oriented prayer networks with a lot of political messaging in the prayers, occasionally including a link when Trump was president to things posted by the White House. Even if you aren't familiar with the movement, you may have seen some of these apostles and prophets pop up in movies and news reports. One that has been particularly visible is Lou Engle, who had the bit part in Jesus Camp, the person handing out the little plastic fetuses to the little children. That was Lou Engle. Lou Engle hosts the call events all over the world, these huge stadium events, including one recently is now called The Send, that featured Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil. And these events have been held all over the world, featuring US politicians, other politicians from around the world. And these events are usually based on a sequence of long prayer sessions, including prayers against abortion, prayers against homosexuality, and then something that's different in this group than Christian Reconstructionism, prayers for Israel. They are now very much at the forefront of Christian Zionism organizing around the world. If you recall, when Rick Perry was running for president in 2011, there was this huge event called The Response. And this was one of Lou Engle's group's prayer rallies that they did for various politicians, with various politicians throughout the country. After this event was when I did the interview with Terry Gross on NPR. Lou Engle is also the founder of Bound for Life, and reportedly the person who came up with the red tape with life written over it. This movement has also intersected with the Tea Party in ways that we're not going to be able to go in great detail, so that we leave time now for speaking. And if you want to ask questions about that, I will address that. But in closing, let me just say they were also very much involved in the Jericho March and the Let the Church Roar events held all over the country. Many of these were organized by new apostolic leaders, including state apostles who had prayer groups. This was something that I saw that was quite remarkable here in Pennsylvania, where I live. And then at the time of the actual event, Lance Wallnau was there. He did not enter the Capitol, as far as I know, but he and others were there. They shared the stage at the event with Oath Keepers, at the event in December at the Capitol, and Lance Wallnau was then again there on January 6th. That's very brief, but I want us to go to questions. I want to put up Frederick Clarkson's definition of dominionism, which, now that you know a little bit more about it, if this is somewhat new to you, you see that he is trying to cover all of this dominionisms in this definition. And I'm going to leave that up for a minute, and let's move on to discussion, because I realize I'm running a little late.
Thank you so very much. And to those of you who have been asking the question if this webinar will be available, the recording of it be available, the answer is yes. So please, I think within the week, it will be available, and all of our webinars we record and they are available for you. Please do share them once you get the link for this. Share it with others who you believe will benefit from getting this information. I'm going to jump to the very first question from Eleanor about donors' trust and Koch industry are also adherents of the Austrian economics that you referenced earlier. Mm-hmm. Are they also supporters of the biblical worldview that you've talked about?
No, not directly. Unfortunately, the story that I didn't have time to tell that's fascinating is how the Koch wing of libertarianism split from the Ron Paul wing. Now, that said, I will say that the Koch brothers and other libertarian donors, I think, do recognize the value of having, of sacralizing libertarianism. Instead of saying, oh, Ayn Rand said this, this is now from God. And so you see a lot of money going even into much more mainstream libertarian, these free market think tanks for projects that merge religion and libertarianism. One think tank in particular that anybody who's interested in this should look at is Acton Institute, heavily funded by the DeVos family, and not Reconstructionist, but they interact with Reconstructionists. Not Reconstructionist, but it has been the source of building an organization to fight acceptance of global warming. And also one of its main agendas is making sure that Catholic bishops and Catholic leaders move away from support of labor unions. And they actually have an additional office in Rome, a block or so away from the Vatican.
Wow.
Hope that answers that.
Thank you. So I have a question as I'm looking at Fred's definition of dominionism and all that you have shared. What happened that brought on the shift from, Christians are called by God to exercise dominion over every aspect of society by taking control of political and cultural institutions. That's a huge shift. When I was growing up in the apostolic church, not this new apostolic movement that you're talking about now, there was very much a in the world but not of it orientation.
Mhm.
So what brought the shift? And that's part A of my question. And then part B of my question really lifts up what Melissa asks: how do we turn the tide on this, or can we turn the tide?
Wow, two big questions. Well, one, I think it was sort of the perfect storm of Rushdoony's work and in the interconnectivity with the growth of conservative infrastructure. All social movements need some infrastructure. And I think, like I said, the perfect storm of Rushdoony getting, and the other Christian Reconstructionists getting this package out there, something that had never been done before. At the same time that there was all of this money and building going on in the new right infrastructure. I think that's one thing that happened. I think another thing that has happened, and this addresses also the second question, we have not paid attention. When I speak, and I sometimes when I'm waiting to get started and people are coming in, back when we used to be able to meet in person, I would do these slide programs and ask people questions to get them involved. And the religious right leaders that everybody can think of are Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell. Well, those were important leaders, but that's old news. And they were never the major thinkers behind this movement. I mean, some of the people we talked about here today were the people who got together and said, we need to bring all of these people in. How do we do it? Let's talk Jerry Falwell into forming the moral majority. So if we are paying attention, if we are looking at this material, we can get out of being in defense all the time. Some of these ideas that I just showed you very quickly have taken 25, 30, 40 years to come down the pipeline and manifest themselves politically. And, I have had conversations with people and organizations inside the Beltway organizations who will say, no, Rachel, I don't want to talk about any of this. Just tell me what they're doing politically. But by the time it manifests itself politically, you're 25, 30 years behind. Yeah. So what we can do is not be 25, 30 years behind with what's going on inside these organizations. I'll tell you something else quickly. The book that Gary North did in support sorry, the old age thing here, but the book that Gary North did where he talked about the lesser magistrate and that you needed the approval of the lesser magistrate, okay? At the end of that, he said, and go study the other side. And this was before social media and all these things, but they listed the contact information of this organization and others at the end of the book.
Thank you for that. And if you would stop your screen share so the audience can see you more fully in our final moments. So earlier you said that the view is social justice is socialism, and there's that negative thinking about socialism. And so related with that, Fred asks the question, what would you say about Christian Reconstructionism and the new apostolic movement and their view on religious freedom?
Okay, Fred is the expert on religious liberty. So we might want to get him to answer this question, but this is a very important point. Religious liberty, it's very straightforward in Christian Reconstructionist material. Religious liberty is not about pluralism. And you saw that quote that I put up from Gary North. Religious liberty does not include tolerance of anything that they don't agree with. It does not include other streams of Christianity, which they don't agree with. It does not include other faiths. So religious liberty is not how we define religious liberty. And this is some, related to this. This is why we need to be studying this, because a lot of games are played with language. And we need to understand exactly what they mean by language that they use that we interpret another way. Freedom and liberty. They're not talking about human rights. All through this material are attacks on human rights as invalid. That there is no such thing as human rights. I know this is hard to get your head around.
Yeah, I'm sitting with it. So,
not in the way that we define human rights.
Okay.
So
Annette said,
that was manufactured by humanists. It is not part of God's law. Does that make more sense? Okay.
Okay. So Annette said we need a part 2 of this great conversation. So I'm going to try to get in 2 more questions.
Okay.
One question from Barbara: do they truly believe this?
Oh, I love this question. Thank you. That was a good plan. I would have planted that question. I think there is a lot of opportunism here. There is a lot of opportunism. Think about what the money can do when, like I said, God says, and I didn't put all of this up there, but God says there should be no income tax. God says there should be no property tax. God says there should be no inheritance tax. And now this is coming from God instead of from the Koch brothers or Ayn Rand. So there is a great deal of opportunism. On the other hand, we really hurt ourselves if we don't understand that they have now raised a generation of people from birth, more than a generation now, in these homeschooling and private school settings where these things are the foundation of all of their knowledge. So for us to think that I'll give you an example. I was in the presence of a major personage I will not name in the Obama administration, who in my presence said, Ted Cruz doesn't really believe all this. He went to these Ivy League schools. He doesn't believe all of this. And I think, unfortunately, this led to the idea that somehow when Ted Cruz went into the room with them in private, he would be a different person. But Ted Cruz grew up in this. His father was on the state roundtable of that 1980 event. He went through this type of schooling. And so I think we actually, at our own risk, believe that all of them don't believe it.
So with that in mind, you're saying a generation and a half or 2 generations have grown up steeped in these teachings. Is there something specifically about abortion you can speak to regarding this? Karen is asking a question about how opposing abortion, is it a means to an end, or is it the thing? Is there something that they're really teaching about what thus saith the Lord? Because that was huge language when I was growing up. Thus saith the Lord. So can you speak to that?
Again, I think it's both. And I think we have to look at both. We have to look at, again, I'll use the word opportunism for this to be a wedge issue that many people will become very emotionally involved in the activism. And then it drives the strategies, tactics, legal maneuvers for many, many other things that don't have anything to do with abortion. On the other hand, I would say we don't want to go too far in that direction. We've got to keep a balance, because I think there are many, many true believers that anything at the point after the egg is fertilized, anything is murder.
So to Annette's point about a part 2, perhaps we need to get you and Fred and Catherine, Fred Clarkson and Catherine Stewart, the 3 of you in a conversation on this. So Fred and Catherine, I hope you heard me say that, and we'll because there's so much more. And we want people to understand what's going on underlying the politics that are happening. And so, of course, in this era where we have some people who have, this has been their breast milk, that they've grown up with these teachings, and others who are opportunists,
Yes.
who then partner with them, it becomes a formidable point of legislative bills against voting rights, against reproductive rights, against so many things, as you said, are human rights, as many of us would define them and understand them. And many of us would see that human rights is something for us to aspire to as guided by our faith. And so understanding a very different frame of the world, a different frame of God and what it is and how it is God is in conversation with God's own creation is a whole different understanding. This has been absolutely amazing. I'm in love with you. I thank you for not only your brilliance, but for your perseverance in looking at these things through the years. As you have said, much has happened over 20, 30 years, as many of us have only known Rush Limbaugh and Pat Robertson. And there have been a whole lot of other things happening behind the scenes. And in our efforts for human rights, for voter rights, for reproductive rights, et cetera, we've really not had a full understanding of the lay of the land that we are operating in. And that's why we're having this particular series of conversations. As I said earlier, this will be the recording of this webinar, and this wonderful conversation with Rachel will be available in the next few days. And so we thank you so very, very much for introducing us to the other Rush. I forgot his full name.
Rushdoony.
Rushdoony. So important for all of us to hear and to understand that, and to know the intersection of people's theological beliefs and political opportunism, and how there has been this perfect storm that we're living in the midst of now. I believe the more we understand this, the more we can work to transform it. And the more we understand that use of language is not the same across groups, and to be clear that we understand how various words are being used in whatever spaces we're in, and by whatever political and religious and community leaders we may hear speaking. Thank you. God bless you. All of you who have come and who have participated in this wonderful conversation today. Again, if we did not have opportunity to respond directly to your question, we have taken note of your questions and trusting that we will be able to respond to them in the online courses that will be launching in another couple of weeks and in subsequent webinars. Thank you and bless you from all of us at RCRC, and blessings especially to you today, Rachel Tabachnick. Goodbye. See you all next time.